Right, thank you very much for the opportunity to share a portion of my research with you all today, titled Visualizing Africa in Chinese Posters, which focuses on African presence in posters produced in China from the 1950s to the late 1980s. Taking posters as one of the early mediums of the Chinese populace's visual interaction with the wider world, I explore the motivations for the appearance of Africans in Chinese posters, which were largely a domestic movement, looking at how and what these contributed to the understanding of Africa through knowledge production and circulation. Today's presentation is based on an analysis of 50 posters produced between the period, obtained from the Shanghai Propaganda Art Center, as well as other digitized collections such as ChinesePosters.net and Paul Pikowicz collection. The focus of the selection is on African subjects, which is determined visually, but also through textual references and historical contextualization. Other foreign subjects, including African Americans, are used as context, but not included in the analysis. A lot of research has been done on Black radicalisms and Sino-African American relations in the Cold War era by scholars such as Keisha Brown, Robeson Tash Frazier, and Gao Yunxiang's latest book to be released in September this year. I'm drawing on Cliff's presentation about African fighters on the borders of China during and after World War II, and whether they were friends or foes. The establishment of the PRC saw Africans in China, at least rhetorically, through posters. I'd be happy to talk more about the production and circulation processes of these posters during the discussion. Revolution was the foundation of friendship and subsequent diplomatic relations. A revolutionary discourse was a space for not only Africans, but also Asians and Latin Americans. These posters unequivocally project Africa as a revolutionary friend, while America is identified as the enemy from whom Africa and the world is supposed to be freed. It is significant, however, that in this data set, there is no mention of France, Portugal, Britain, Spain, all of whom in the 60s, 1960s and 70s still had some colonies in Africa despite resistance. And this raises the question of whose foe is being referred to here. The closest mention of these other actors is the rare use of the term 殖民主义者, colonialists. And revolutionary posters draw on regional experiences from the Korean War, the Vietnam War, the Taiwan Strait crisis, all of which had a significant American involvement. These posters of Africa specifically focused more on an extension of China's fight against Meidi, American imperial hegemony, than with the actual enemies that their revolutionary friends in Africa were concerned with fighting. Posters also served to commemorate some ongoing events, and they were produced in response to these events. Some of these events are the US involvement in the Congo crisis, for instance, Britain's involvement in the Swiss crisis, among others. They play the role of commemorating these revolutionary events, crises, and achievements sometimes, and were used to declare China's stance and attitude towards these events. From the mid-1960s, there began to be a more overt presence of Mao and his ideology in African and Third World revolutionary posters. Prior to this, Mao's symbolisms or Mao's portraits, as overtly seen in the picture to the right, did not appear in posters of international subjects, though they were very present in posters that depicted domestic life. This change takes place during the Cultural Revolution and the rise of Mao personality cult in an attempt to emphasize Mao as the figurehead of the world's revolutionary movement in an extension of China's discourse of revolution. Hence, no image of African revolutionary leaders featured in these posters. The angle of interaction of this poster, for instance, is slightly from bottom up, which makes the subjects appear more dominant and prominent and powerful, and an idea that is supported by the artillery that they wield. This, however, enables us to see the title of the book that they are holding, which is selected works of Mao Zedong, while reiterating the importance of Mao's ideology in the liberations struggle by the captions which reads, Chairman Mao is the leader of the world, is the savior of the world's revolutionary people. This suggests some form of unequal power relations between Africa and China, expressed through ideological dominance, as shown in in this image, for instance. The fact that Africans are depicted to read challenges stereotypes, some stereotypes of the African as illiterate, while highlighting the importance of Mao's ideology to the liberation struggle. From the 1960s, themes of posters begin to broaden beyond revolution. There is also an increased realism in images that seem to conform with relative increase in Chinese activities on the continent, official visits, and including student mobility. These themes expand to include these exchanges, sports, utopian society, non-military aid, gender, among others. From this mid-60s onwards, posters see a shift from this predominance in ideology that we see in revolutionary posters to a depiction of what China was doing on the continent. There is an increase in specificity as well, with references to individual countries as opposed to the continent as a whole. Well, the Great Leap Forward was an unsuccessful socio-economic campaign to ramp up agricultural production and industrialization within a short period of time through mass mobilization. This ambition was, however, complicated by famine in the late 1950s and early 60s. In recovering from unspeakably hard times, there was the need to instill hope. Hence, we see during this period several depictions of flourishing economy, advanced transportation networks, theater arenas, major industrial infrastructure, flourishing economy, domestic life, and happy people, among others. These tend to reflect a picture of a life hoped for, as opposed to what is the reality, so to speak. And this good life had visiting friends from afar to bear witness to a flourishing China. Medical aid depicted medical personnel, popularly known as the barefoot doctors in African communities. This term referred to part rural healthcare worker, part peasant, who worked in hard to reach communities. Health personnel were sent to various parts of the African continent in spite of shortage at home. The reference to healthcare workers as barefoot doctors, healthcare workers sent to African countries as barefoot doctors, on the one hand suggests a similarity of the continent to rural China. It evokes a sense of distance, while revolutionary posters sought to construct proximity. Thus, there is an ambivalent portrayal of Africa, both as close comrade and distant other. These posters showcase African agency, as we see, for instance, here, an African doctor working side by side their Chinese counterpart, which leads to knowledge exchange, among others. Still in the 60s, however, Mao's saviorhood is present even in these non-revolutionary posters. This saviorhood is internationalized by duplicating domestic discourse onto foreign subjects, as seen by this group of Africans looking up to a portrait of Mao with the inscription, "Long live Chairman Mao." Mostly produced by art groups of railway construction companies, the Tazara Railway project is the major infrastructural project in Chinese posters. These posters, one of such posters, for instance, foregrounds Chinese railway workers, while in the distant background, we see local communities going about their daily activities. Unlike medical engagement, these posters do not take into account numerous unskilled and skilled local workers who worked with Chinese construction workers on this project. The focus is on the role of the Chinese workers while ignoring the collaborative work environment that led to some form of interaction among workers from China, Tanzania, and Zambia. As the project is referred to in these posters as the Friendship Railway, a depiction of how it fostered interactions at the grassroots and how it fostered friendships would have been essential. Women's liberation in China was unified with that of the working class upon the establishment of the PRC. In an attempt to eradicate gender differences, women, especially in revolutionary posters, dressed like men. This attempt not to see gender, however, resulted in making masculinity the default by which Chinese women tried to fit in, thereby reinforcing the dominance of masculinity. African women are, however, differentiated not only by their clothing, but are often marked by reinforcing socially assigned maternal roles, regardless of the circumstances. For example, we see an African woman armed with a rifle and with a determined demeanor, but carries a baby on her back. Subjects are also carefully selected to avoid ambiguity. This is reflected in the geographical choice of women in particular in posters, which is mainly from sub-Saharan Africa. Though there are numerous men from Algeria to Egypt in revolutionary posters, for instance, the absence of women discounts the tens of thousands of women involved in the fights for independence in the region. The decline of posters in the 1980s was propelled by the shift in focus under Deng Xiaoping and his economic reform and opening up of China. This was also at a time when the party grappled with how to present its history without highlighting the negative effects of some of Mao's policies on the ordinary people. A shift in media was therefore a convenient way to avoid engaging with these memories. This was also conditioned and facilitated by the development of and transition to other forms of media. Television, for instance, reached 2/3 of the Chinese population by 1985. In recent years, we see occasionally we see increasing posters in subway lines in Beijing, for instance, and also in posters, particularly of African subjects. There was a resurgence of that during the killing of the African-American George Floyd in the US, and these were circulating on social media platforms in the discourse of friends and foe around this. From the 1970s onwards, and particularly in the late 1980s, the posters became increasingly memorabilia with number of collectors both in China and outside China increasing. Chinese posters tended to sell an ideal of utopian society, an ideology of communism with Chinese characteristics, or renegotiated public opinion. The African presence in visual discourse forms part of a China narrative, particularly one of internationalizing revolution, but also shows a shift from ideological to more concrete actions of China in Africa. It tells us more about China than it does about Africa. There is little about work and life depicted in Africa shown in these posters. And this actually highlights the focus for China and hints on a limited exposure of an understanding of the continent beyond themes that were of interest to China. They veer off some popular narratives of Africa while focusing on themes that were pertinent to China's continuous revolution and quest for recognition as an ideological leader of the third world. And the posters from this period reinforcing these themes that were pertinent to China, however, served to make the narrative of Africa as the revolutionary friend that is being helped by China, one of the most dominant till date. I look forward to the discussions and suggestions and questions. Thank you very much.